Welcome to the Simpleton podcast. I'm Clark Massey. I'm here in Kansas City. We're the official podcast of A Simple House, and I'm here with Laura Heeman, who is in
Washington, D.C.
Hello, Laura.
Hey, Clark. How's it going?
Just fine.
Great.
All right. All right. Our big topic today is how Simple House developed a model of evangelization based on accompaniment. And how we were forced to develop that over time. And that's what we're going to go over. But we're also going to talk about the world that Simple House was kind of born into. Catholic culture around the year 2000, there was a big schism in the church around charitable work. Not a formal schism you're ever going to read about in church history, but there was a huge awkwardness, you know? And then also, we're going to go over the spiritual hazards of missionary work and like even trying to create a theory of missionary work. Like Jesus told the Pharisees, who were kind of the religious conservatives of his day, that when they created a convert, they made him twice the son of hell that they were. And you certainly don't want to be doing that. But to take that quite seriously whenever we try to figure this stuff out.
Yeah.
So I think we're going to start with Simple House and like what our goals were that Laura, you and I seem to just kind of like get from the beginning.
Right.
And very little of it was kind of put down on paper, and we didn't really have a training method or anything like that. But we both, I felt like we're on the same page of knowing what we were shooting for.
Yeah. And I think that we were both kind of at that time going for, thinking about what's our personal response. You didn't have an idea. We didn't have an idea of like, we're starting this community of people and we're all going to go out. It was more like, how are we going to personally respond, to the cry of the poor, to a call from God.
Yeah. So, and that's, that's consistent with our vision from the beginning. Was there was no effort to make a community. There was no effort to establish something forever. We'd both been through like seeing a couple ministries close. The permanence, like I think the goal was to work on it as if it were permanent, but no, it might not be, and not assume that anyone would ever join except, just a couple people who like, I wanted to do it full time. You were doing part time at that point. And we just had no real idea that other people would join. Yeah. We also we wanted to bring more people out to do the work kind of for their good and also for the poor. But, it was going to be absolutely okay if it never grew.
Exactly.
And I think our goals were like, we just had these at an intuitive level, not at a conscious level or a level where, we had analytically broken it down, but we wanted to be very authentic. We wanted to love people in the way of like helping them, like just in concrete ways, material help, kind of the material works of mercy. But then in also spiritual ways that it wouldn't make sense to help someone in a ton of material ways and then like not want to share the truth, Yeah. Exactly. It also wouldn't make sense to share the truth, but not lift a finger to help someone, in this life concretely, So that was kind of where we were going. And it sounds like almost an obvious idea what we were trying to do, but for some reason it wasn't obvious because the Catholic culture was kind of in a weird place at that moment. How would you explain that?
Yeah, so there was like a division between like the social justice Catholics and the pro-life Catholics, or the people that were into doing charitable work versus the people that were orthodox. And I think like when I was in college in the early 2000s, I think there was like starting to be I had kind of more liberal theology professors, and there was maybe starting to be like a suspicion of that, or an idea that wasn't quite right and we needed to go back to orthodoxy or something. But that was like kind of the flavor of Catholic U. And I think a lot of campus ministries weren't there. And so when we were, starting a Simple House, like you'd have these conversations with like, quote unquote, more liberal people, and they'd be very excited that we were doing charitable work. And then as soon as you mentioned like praying with people or Bible studies, they were like, whoa, So it was like we were like too conservative for them. But then our conservative friends were like, what are you doing? You're helping the poor, And so, so there was just this kind of strange thing of being too liberal for one group and too conservative for the other.
And I think that like our conservative friends or like would have been fine if it was like a very concrete help that was very clean. But this idea that you were going to like go into people's houses, that the houses could have, like roaches everywhere and, kind of like get your elbows dirty with the poor was kind of what really kind of weirded people out. And they also were just suspicious, I think, because there was something about this schism. I'm calling it the schism right now, that there was something about it that was self-reinforcing. That someone who really loved the church and was Orthodox would show up to like a social justice style ministry and find out that everyone was pro-choice and they had no problem with a lot of things, right? And then the person would be scandalized and upset and like not really want to serve with a pure heart there and would leave, right? But then also a kind of a social justice Catholic would show up at a conservative type meeting and be like scandalized that they don't seem to be that concerned about like the social situations of the day and the poor and things like that. Like there seemed to be a lack of compassion. And
right, but it was to the point that it was like helping the poor became shorthand for like liberal Catholic, and being pro-life became shorthand for conservative Catholic that didn't care about the lives of these babies after they were born.
Right. And it felt like it was like an American political divide that had somehow become imprinted on Catholic culture.
Yeah.
And
like there was I always had this feeling in college and have continued to have it after that, like, are some people like confusing republicanism with being a good Catholic? Like it didn't seem clear of where the sort of political preference was and the Catholic identity,
Right.
Yeah.
And this particular schism, which felt very defined then to the point that it was just like hard to point at anyone who was kind of good in both ways. And we were trying to become that. We were trying to stand in the gap there,
right.
Yeah. And it felt very alienating because it felt like we didn't have any friends in a sense, right?
Yeah,
like we weren't really getting endorsed by either group and I was getting turned away. If you were asking for money, you'd get like weird questions and things like that, right?
Yeah.
And I think that this has largely gone away. Like, I don't think it's that, I don't think we're scandalous as a ministry anymore. I don't think it feels like we're standing in the gap anymore. I think you could start a Orthodox Catholic ministry to the poor and it wouldn't raise a bunch of questions.
Right.
Right now. And I feel like sometimes what Catholics do, and I am very guilty of this myself, is we're sometimes fighting the last war. What
do you mean by that?
Well, this has happened to me a couple times, but like this week, someone was talking about liturgical kind of weirdness and talking about like, I don't want to go to mass and be singing Kumbaya. You know what I mean? And I thought 20 years ago, I think that happened way more than today.
Yeah.
Like if I wanted to find Kumbaya in a Catholic church, I would search it out in my diocese and there's a couple places I would look and I might have to go through a couple masses before I saw something I thought was weird.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
Whereas like 20 years ago, you could just stumble into it.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like you'd just be like, you'd be like something cringeworthy would happen, like on the regular. Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so to me, like if you're today, like really worried about that, well, I mean, that's like yesteryear's battle.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like, like that battle's largely won. It's not that it doesn't, but you're kind of in the, you're kind of the cleanup crew on that,
Yeah. Yeah.
And I felt like, today, if someone just characterizes the conservatives as not being charitable, I would say you're kind of grinding an axe. I'm not seeing that. But But around the year 2000, I did see that.
Yeah, totally. And I remember even talking to college students or recently graduated people, like I would be at a party with maybe like more conservative Catholics, and from certain schools I would say like, oh, we do this ministry, and it was just like shutting down goodbye. And it was like crazy, like it was like really obvious. People were like, not interested in that even enough to be polite to you. So
well, like my wife's uncle and godfather is one of the founders of Christendom College, and like we got turned down pretty quick to go talk at Christendom College.
Yeah, I wasn't trying to say it was Christendom, but it was Christendom.
Well, it could have been other places too. But
Yeah, no,
let's
but yeah. Anyway,
let's tell some
yeah.
stories about just how that was felt in the church right then. Like one time I got pulled over in Northern Virginia driving the ministry van. I think I'd made an illegal turn or whatever, and the cop pulled up behind me. And it's always weird when you get pulled over in the ministry van because the real legal name of a simple house is Saints Francis and Alphonsus.
STS, Francis, ampersand, Alphonsus.
Yes, which most people, I don't know, when we started, STS to me obviously meant saints in plural, but to almost no one else it means that. So when you get pulled over, they like run your plates and they're like, this is owned by who? And who are you? Francis and Alphonsus, you know? So the cop came up and he's, questioning me about who owns the vehicle. And my take now is like, just accept tickets, don't fight, get out of things, roll. You know what I mean? Don't feel bad. I'm going to get so many tickets in my life. Let's do it. But the cop's like I'm like, well, we're a Catholic mission. He goes, oh, then he goes back to his car, comes back and he goes, are you a Catholic mission like you help the poor, or are you missionaries like for real? And I was like, well, we aspire to really be missionaries, and he's like, okay, I'm giving you a warning. Don't do that. Carry on.
Yeah. So that meant something to him.
Right. And he didn't strike me as like a genius or anything, but it was just like he knew that there was this weird distinction happening.
Yeah.
That if you said Catholic mission, you didn't necessarily mean missionary or anything, by that. Yeah. And he wanted to know, And a similar thing would happen that like part of the problem here was that there was a big paranoia of proselytizing.
Yeah.
I still see that a little bit today, but it was even more paranoid 20 years ago. And I think this comes from this kind of educational bias we all have that all history is power struggle, And in that way of talking about history and society, the Catholic Church is merely the the spiritual imperialism of the West, and we're like extra tricky imperialism,
I think, and it was to the point missionary was more in that time a Protestant word. It was not a word that Catholics were using a lot. We tended to introduce ourselves as volunteers. If someone kind of figured out we were a missionary, I felt like I had to explain, yes, I am. And if you have a weird idea, here it is.
It was also, and I think a lot of how Catholics have rediscovered being missionaries with kind of like everything that Focus has done and stuff has sometimes been inspired by Protestants.
Yeah, totally.
Like we re-imported it back in. And I may even remember religious orders back then who were missionary orders, like the Redemptorists or what. They even would backpedal and kind of feel confused about how to explain what missionary was, because the paranoia of proselytizing was so complete that there almost was no valid mission work.
Yeah, and I think it could even make you sometimes almost do bad ministry or something. I felt like I had to spend a lot of time explaining to donors, everything we do is totally free. We don't require people to go to church. We don't require people to pray with us. It's totally a gift, and then the people, the poor people whose houses we were going to would be like, so can you pray with me?
Right.
Are you gonna invite me to church? And you're like, sorry. So it was like the donors wanted to sort of know that we were not doing that, and the people we were trying to help were like, can you please do that?
Right. The poor were not afraid of proselytizing. And in a way, it was kind of patronizing to them to say that they were so weak in their intellect or faith that you could walk in and just beat them into some new belief, with some,
absolutely.
work.
And a lot of people have, had opinions about the people that would come to their door, and they were happy to have us, but maybe not Jehovah's Witnesses or something,
Sure.
So they had ideas about who they wanted to come, but it was weird that we were coming to their door. we would meet people that were like, oh, so you're from the Catholic Church. Like, once a Catholic priest like helped my mother, 30 years ago. And it was this distant memory, that a Catholic person had come to them.
Because somehow we'd gotten in our own way, you know what I mean, in serving the poor. And I think that like the problem was in the universities and in the donors. It was not with the poor. And like when I would explain our mission to the poor or to like my family in rural Kansas, it would be like, oh, you're just trying to be Christian. I'd be like, yes.
That is so profound.
Right. And they kind of got it at an intuitive level, but like putting it at this analytic level, it's like trying to explain you're not a racist or whatever. The mere act of trying to explain how you're not a racist keeps the person suspicious you are.
Yeah, right.
So like the more I try to tell you I'm not proselytizing, I sound like a proselytizer.
Right, exactly. It's like you.
And I remember like we had like Georgetown donors who were like, I'd explain our ministry. They wouldn't seem to get it. I'd finally say, look, you have to read some of the stories, like the real life, or like, let me tell you a particular encounter we had. And then you're either going to get it or you're not. And if you don't get it, that's fine. But that's the way you're going to understand what we do, because we're having a real hard time communicating. And then they would say, well, just give me the statistics.
Yeah.
Like how many people you fed and stuff. And so every once in a while, I would actually compute statistics. We've made this many visits. Yeah. We helped this many people get health care, this many people enroll in school, this many people we fed, right? And sometimes the statistics were impressive.
Yeah, and sometimes they weren't.
Well, sometimes they weren't, but the point was, even when they were impressive, you were clueless about what we were as a mission.
Yeah.
Like if you looked at our stats and said, oh, I like this, I'd like to support them, you don't know what you're supporting if you're making that decision based on the statistics.
Yeah. I think so we had I assume we're talking about the same Georgetown donors, like a long relationship with this like community in Georgetown. And yes, at the beginning, they really did want the numbers. They wanted to have like kind of the hard, good thing that they were doing. But I do think a lot of them came around and they kind of knew some of the people we helped by name because we would tell them stories. And even, do you remember, like there was a family that we helped that they had a son that was into like writing poetry. And so some of them kind of like took him on and they would, take him on these outings. They would work on him reciting his poetry and teach him how to play golf. That was like, and it's like, how like not productive is that? And so it was great. Like they kind of like.
Yeah, I guess what I said, Georgetown, I wasn't meaning that particular parish that helped us out. I was kind of thinking in general, like Northern Virginia or just kind of wealthy people. Who would be in the position to help us, Yeah. And there were also two stories that kept coming up that I think I politely listened to who knows how many times, but they would tell me the story of the rice Christians. Mm-hmm. That it was like the Jesuits in India would give out rice before church, and so church was always full, and then they quit giving out rice and no one would come to church or they'd be angry, you know? And it was like, well, clearly we don't want to be that, but why do you keep telling me this story? Mm-hmm. Like it's like boom, like enlightened, right? And then the other one was the social justice story about, if you keep finding people drowning in a river and you pull them out, you should walk up the road and you'll see that there's a man on a bridge throwing people in the river, and it'd be better to stop that man than like do the structural reform as opposed to just like be charitably helping people out of the river. And I was told that story so many times by people who like, it's like, this should blow your mind. Here you go. Here's the distinction, Yeah. And the story's true enough. Like, whenever you can stop the guy from throwing people in the river, that's what you should do. Mm-hmm. I think we, from the beginning, knew that we weren't going to be very political and that we were going to be very personal. Mm-hmm. We were going to love Bob, not always worried about all the systems that affect Bob. Yeah. But whenever we had to fight systems, we have. And
I think both of us were very moved by the example of Mother Teresa. And I think this was going on when I was like, a child and a teenager. But later as an adult, I realized, there were people that thought Mother Teresa was like a kind of a monstrous person because she didn't do any of the like big picture change.
Right. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's crazy. Yeah.
Yeah. When she died, there was like a negative op-ed in the New York Times, going after Mother Teresa for not doing structural change.
Right.
And I think we'll have to talk about this more in depth later, but part of the problem there is like an eschatological problem. That Mother Teresa saw all these people as living eternally, and that every act of love is an eternal act. Whereas people who don't believe in that eschatology tend to think that it's all about this life and it's all about fixing the systems in this life to make it better. Whereas Mother Teresa saw her work, even with someone who's going to die in a few days, as eternally important.
Yeah.
Not just a few days of important.
Yeah. I kind of think it's an interesting thing to think about. Like a thing that has been kind of especially horrific during COVID is the idea of people dying in the hospital by themselves. Like everyone knows that's like wrong. I'm not trying to say what should or shouldn't have happened, but everyone like mourned that. Well,
it's been happening to my own dad, who's been in a nursing home this last year, and we're now visiting him in person, and it just was like cruel and unusual. So these hang-ups were kind of the hang-ups from the liberal side. You know what I mean? Like the Rice Christian idea, the paranoia of proselytizing and stuff like that, right? But there was also a little bit of a hang-up from the orthodox side of treating sometimes people outside of the church as other or heathen. And the accompaniment model we were employing was kind of like, look, we're 25 or 26 or younger even, and we're sitting here with a 50-year-old grandma who is a different race than we are, had a completely different life experience than us. And we're hanging out and chatting and being friends. And it's like, are you going to disciple this person? Does this person maybe have insights into the human experience that could be revolutionary for you, and are we open to receiving that? But then at the same time, we all have our own, informed by our faith, our take on the human experience that we also share, And I remember one time, I don't know if this paper still exists, but there was kind of this, it was considered pretty out there newspaper called The Wanderer. These were people who were kind of so Catholic that they always had a problem with the Pope, JP2, I don't think they were SSPX, but they were close to schismatic Catholic. And a Wanderer reporter came and asked if he could follow me around for a day in Southeast DC. And I was like, sure, that would have been an answer to anybody, but I was interested in meeting him too. So he came out and we went around all day, and I showed him around, and we went through the public housing and talked to some people that, I work with the ministry. And I remember near the end of the day, he asked, he said something as he was leaving Simple House, clearly you do this because you think these people are all going to hell, and you're trying to save a few of them from eternal damnation, right?
Yes.
And I was taken aback when he said that. And at the same time, I'm I'm very intentionally agnostic about judging the eternal fate of anyone.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I don't want to presume God's forgiveness or his judgment either way, right?
Yeah.
And and I don't know how I could have operated if I desperately thought everyone we were working with was going to hell. And I don't know how I could have done this love, for them, right? And so it's I'm kind of worried that everyone's going to hell and hoping they're all going to heaven all at the same time.
Yeah. I remember talking in the early days about we kind of thought that the more appropriate attitude was a more generous attitude towards everyone except for yourself.
You got to be kind of generous to yourself too, because otherwise you kind of start sinning against God's mercy. You know what I mean? And, but that's right. Like if you're going to be hard on someone, be a little bit hard on yourself. Don't be hard on the poor, Yeah.
And yours is the only heart that you can see into, you're the only person. Right.
And also I think that models after Jesus. that he was like, we once broke down all the different interactions of Jesus and who he was interacting with. And the times he was the least judgmental, the most compassionate were with public sinners. People who just had obvious problems,
I want to say just another thing. I feel like maybe this is like a different, this is an idea that persists, but it was maybe had a little bit of a different shape. Like there was like a more conservative suspicion of like, if you help these people, are you enabling these people?
Right.
And it was like, just go down there for a day. It's plain to see that there's not the same, opportunity. It's not just a matter of choosing to do better and doing better, and that was like a weird thing also. Like people had watched too many hopeful movies about the hood in the 90s and thought like you could just decide.
And then everything was going to be okay.
Yeah.
We need to talk about this, about what conversion is and the normal way God works with people. Because it was kind of like like we literally would have people show up who would think, there's this temptation to think that people are just going to fall over, quit using crack, and get their life together. You know what I mean? Because they realized a truth, or because the Holy Spirit came down and just did it,
The other idea is like, there can be that one special teacher in the high school who will change the lives of all the students, and then they'll all go to college.
Right.
And it's just like, what a crazy thing, and occasionally you get some special people who have that will or have that drive or have that spark, and you get a special teacher, but that's not the, I don't know. Anyway.
Yeah. And sometimes the spark isn't even coming from a nice person.
Yeah.
Sometimes the word that changes your life is a word of prophecy that just comes out of someone who's not even trying to help you. They might be insulting you, So when we were doing this, we were acting almost entirely in the, I would like to, at one point, by the way, do some analysis about how did the church get to this weird place where charitable work was so scandalous, But this seems to have resolved, and it seems to have partly resolved because a lot of the social justice Christian part of the church seems to have gone away, I still see it, but I see it as like almost like a temporary phenomena of maybe new college graduates sometimes, but then they're often not Catholic 10 years later, And I consider that kind of tragic, but it also means it's just not the big problem anymore. It's the social justice versus charitable work schism problem, But we also were operating without a good analytical framework. I think maybe that's why the schism existed in the church, is no one was writing it up real well, and figuring it out. And when two people, let me use a model for this. I have a good friend who was a great friend of this ministry and also served with the ministry, who was like a really good second grade teacher, right? And she knew both kind of like how to be a good teacher and was like a reading specialist, but also knew when the class was about to like pop off. Right, and like who the ringleaders were and what the social dynamic, like a really good stand-up comedian who's like reading the room and changing the act based on what the room's response and the feedback and everything with the room, right? And so to me, like what brought this to my attention was this person was such a good second grade teacher that they became a teacher of second grade teachers. The person who helped other second grade teachers be good teachers. And it struck me that like all the analytical stuff, all the cut and dry stuff, all the little reward systems you can do in a classroom, when you assign stuff, what order you do things in, what habits you have the class do, that's all teachable, right?
Yeah.
But this like read the room part, that really probably made her from a good to a great teacher.
Yeah.
Where do you teach that?
Right.
And the same's true in mission work, like a lot of it's teachable, but then there's this final thing where it's like you also had at CUA, there was a great campus minister who'd kind of reformed CUA's campus ministry, Father Bob, right? And it was like, man, if only we could do this at every university, it would be amazing. but it was almost like you couldn't write down what you correct. You know this situation better than me. I don't think you could have written down what Father Bob did.
He had a way about him that people were attracted to, and he was generous and kind and could talk to any student on campus, and
I remember even when he made decisions that people thought were wrong, in the long run, he was always right.
Yeah, right. I know. And we keep in touch with him like a tiny bit, like we, talk to him maybe once a year or something. But, when I was in college, so I worked in the campus ministry for 1 year, and it was like I found some of his ideas or things he would insist on so annoying, and and now in the long run, I'm like, wow, Father Bob was an amazing man with amazing insight, and I think a holy man, which is not like, I don't know, dealing with him day to day in college, I was like, oh, what a pain, Father Bob. That wasn't my dominating feeling about him, but yeah, he was great. Anyway.
But there's something about this intuitive realm of being good at something that also in the missionary sense, grace has to be a big part of this. I mean, grace and prayer and things like this. And discernment seems to be almost what we're talking about right now. But if you have two people who are gifted in this way, they can kind of see eye to eye, and they can kind of sharpen each other and make each other even reach a new height by talking and comparing notes. But the problem is they're talking about something that's so ill-defined. It's like they have to invent the language, create the stories to make the points. Kind of like when Jesus speaks in parables, he's not like saying, here's some theology. He's like, here's a story. Let me see if I can break through to you with this story, right? And I felt like that's what you and I were doing, and we were even kind of inventing language about like we'd do some bad ministry, and we'd come back and be like, well, what happened there?
That was a mistake. Yeah.
You know what I mean? And then we'd like name that type of mistake, and then we'd try to move on. Yeah. And it came to the point that we started to have people joining Simple House, and we needed to get analytical. Like we needed to figure out what part of this missionary work we do can be put down on paper, and what part of this missionary work we do is forever going to be a little bit in the intuition zone.
Yeah, but with the intuition zone, I think you can always like train your intuition. Even if you have good intuition, you need to train your intuition, And there's like, back to the second grade teacher example, maybe there's a person that's not that good at reading the room. But you got to say to them, listen, when things are getting a little out of hand, usually being more stern is not the thing that's going to work, or something. Like you can kind of clue them in, like this way you're reacting is amping things up, or, whatever it is. Like you got to clue people in. I
agree with you, but I think it's limited.
I mean, I agree with that. Yeah.
Yeah. And like one of the other parts of intuition that we have to use at Simple House, and that probably everyone has to use at some point in their life, is we call it like the Spidey Sense. Yeah. Like one of Spider-Man's lesser known superpowers is to be able to tell when things are getting dangerous. Yeah. Right? Yeah. And if you're walking in the hood where drive-by shootings happen and like cop jump outs happen and all types of things happen, you need to have a sense of when you got to get the hell out.
Yeah. Well, there's like some female missionaries we've had have not been good matches for doing ministry with certain men because they're not, their Spidey sense is off, or their reaction is off to being like hit on or something, Right. Yeah.
And to a certain extent, you can talk to people and help, and you'll see people improve. And to another extent, I'm just like, all right, this person's never going to get this. We just need to put them in a situation where they can succeed, where this is not a big part of the job,
Hey, I have to tell you an embarrassing story about being hit on.
Okay.
So, back in the early days, I was like in my young 20s, this was like a thing I had to, be mindful of, and so it was like all the time, there were these like come-ons or like guys asking for my number, not for missionary purposes, so this was just like a part of the work. But the other day, this like, this kid comes to the house, trying to sell me a bag of food he got from the rec center. And I'm like, I'm not going to buy your bag of food. But we start chatting. And then he's like, well, do you have any work? And I said, let me see if there's any yard work, here, and I'll get back to you. And he's like, okay, well, great. Well, give me your number. And I was like, do you want my number because you want to do yard work? And he was like, yes. So I am old now. I am not trying.
Good.
Yeah.
There's
happened.
freedom in that.
There is freedom in that. It was also like really embarrassing, and he was like so disturbed by the fact I thought he was trying to get my number, so that happened.
Someday we're going to have to tell the story of the guy who was hitting on you. And then when he wanted to leave the room, he wouldn't walk. He would just fall asleep while we were there.
Yeah.
He would fake fall asleep just to like leave the conversation. But we'll have to, that's a story worth a different day. But let's get back to this. All right. So the analytical intuitive was interesting. And I remember when we first were trying to tackle the problem, I started searching because I thought, surely this missionary work is such an important thing. Surely there's got to be like a lot of like data or journal articles or books on how to do it, and I was kind of searching within Catholic world, not Protestant world, for it. And I remember I found the word missiology, which is the study of missions.
Yeah.
And I thought, when I figured that word out, I thought, this is a breakthrough. Now I know the right thing to search. I will have a gold mine of information. And then I found out that the American Catholic Missiology Society was right near the shrine, right in DC. One of the cool things about DC is every single religious order organization has an office in DC. They often used to have an office in St. Louis too. It was the two places in the nation where you could have a house of every religious order, So I was like, great. So I call them, and I literally get denied membership into the Missiology Association, right? And so I'm down, and I can't find anything with missiology in the Dominican House library that seemed meaningful. And then I did more searches, and I thought, okay, Black and Indian missions. I've heard this term.
Just the context for all these searches that you're talking about is this is before Google was so ubiquitous.
I'm pretty sure I searched it on Google, but the internet was not as complete back then.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And there was also a sense in which I knew that some of this stuff would be old, because there were so few people doing mission work that I knew that this would be I was hoping for stuff from the 50s or something, or from foreign missions, And then, so then the Black and Indian missions. So this is something that almost all Catholics have heard of because it's one of only 3 nationwide appeals in the Catholic Church for money. At every parish, and its headquarters is also in DC, right? Yeah. It's a little townhouse in the Foggy Bottom area.
Yep.
So I could not get them to return a phone call. I couldn't get a live person on the other end at Black and Indian missions. And our mission was we served more than 100 people, of which 98 out of 100 were Black.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? DC was very racially divided. And I remember and the 2 that weren't Black, one was white and one was Puerto Rican, married to a Black guy.
Yeah.
That's the only 2 people I can remember from back then that weren't Black. Yeah. And so I thought, well, we're clearly a Black mission.
Yeah.
And we've got 3 years under our belt or something, I should talk to these people about materials, maybe funding, whatever, right? Couldn't get any calls back. And that's something, by the way, I feel like I'm interested in doing this podcast partly because I'm expecting that the listeners might go out and found a mission.
Yeah.
Right. All right. So tips and tricks for founding your mission. There are a lot of things in the Catholic Church that get kind of nailed down.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? Like a Black and Indian mission type thing could be the Marianol Fathers or whatever legacy institutions did that type of work. May be always the ones who get those grants.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yep.
And breaking into that it now seems more possible at Simple House because we're over 15 years old.
Yeah.
but like you're just not going to break into these things were set up and created for those groups.
Yeah.
And they may just not return your phone calls even. They might even not tell you why you're not going to qualify. So,
well, it's similar when we were trying to get listed like in the official list of Catholic ministries in the country or whatever.
Right.
That took forever.
Very painful process to get in the Kennedy directory or the official Catholic directory, which is necessary to qualify for all types of stuff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I did find on the internet this one thing called Evangelical Catholic. Mm-hmm. And it was out of Minneapolis, which I didn't really understand at the time is kind of the birthplace of net ministries, and a lot of cool Catholic stuff has come out of Minneapolis, St. Paul area. Yeah. And Evangelical Catholic was up there, and I don't think it still exists. But at the time, they literally had missionary training materials.
Yeah.
And I sent them money, and they sent me some materials, and we did not use hardly any of it. But I honestly, it felt so lonely being in the space. I was so inspired that just someone else was in the space.
Yeah.
That I later became friends with some of the first Focus missionaries. I still know them, and they were living out here in Kansas City. But like, it was interesting time to try to figure out how to write a manual to train missionaries.
Yeah.
And I think besides like a bunch of stuff we created that we need to go over, like kind of the do's and don'ts of mission work, and also some do's and don'ts of kind of like spiritual pitfalls of like thinking what becoming a saint is that it's not. Pope Benedict, which he wrote this when he was Cardinal Ratzinger, wrote a book called Introduction to Christianity. And I think it's from the 70s. And
I'm not sure. Yeah.
It's from the 70s or 80s. But in my mind, I thought Introduction to Christianity was such a misnomer because it's such a dense book.
Yeah.
That it's like graduate course in Christianity should have been like the name of it,
Right. Yeah.
But I really think it influenced our missionary training more than any other work. I don't even think I properly credit Pope Benedict in our manual enough for the ideas I took from him.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it'd be like a footnote every page. Also copied from Pope Benedict.
Right.
So that was revolutionary. But I also think that there were some pitfalls we were trying to avoid. One I came across recently, like the book, How the Irish Saved Civilization, is a pretty cool book. Most historians I know have given it a thumbs up for being mostly accurate, And one of the unbelievable claims the author makes is there were no missionaries before St. Patrick. Which I think is about 500 AD.
Yeah.
So all the Christians and all the missionary work that happened before St. Patrick, the people did not self-identify as missionaries.
Right. They were just doing
Christians.
Yeah. They were just Christians.
So in the age of the great evangelization, where Christianity experienced its most successful growth, missionaries were not operating as missionaries, right?
Right.
And I think we should take that very seriously as like a warning.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then to add to that warning is Jesus pointing at the Pharisees and say, you cross, seas and land to make one convert, and you make him twice the son of hell you are.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And I think that verse is about proselytizing. And someday we need to do a podcast on proselytizing versus mission work, where we try to parse those two things and create real room for mission work, Yeah,
absolutely.
But another bias that I feel like has been a problem for missionary work, and I feel like it was as true 20 years ago as it is true right now, which is that sometimes the way that we explain the good news to each other is almost as if it's with a comforting or confirmation bias type technique. It's almost like, here's an even better reason that you're doing what you're already doing.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And it doesn't seem to keep the scandal of Christ intact when we operate like that. The great unspoken thing about the Bible, that's like one of its main points that we hardly ever talk about, is that Christ was killed by religious people.
Yeah.
you know? And it wasn't like the Roman government had it out for him. It was both, and it wasn't just conservative religious people and liberal religious people. It was the liberals and the conservative religious people who killed him, and they high-fived each other while they did it.
Right.
You know? The Sadducees were like the group that had compromised with the Roman Empire, was running the temple, had less teachings than the Pharisees, less books of the Bible, just the Pentateuch, right? And they were kind of the compromised, kind of with it group of the day. And then the Pharisees were kind of the opposite, like way more teachings. You know, they didn't just have the law of Moses; they kind of had a hedge around the law of Moses. They were like going to be extra careful not ever to sin. And both of them, you know, Jesus is like upturning the money changers that the Sadducees have, you know, set up, but he's also just like scandalizing the Pharisees, where they both need to get rid of Jesus, you know? And it wasn't the prostitutes or the tax collectors or the sinners that needed to get rid of Jesus. It was the holy people that had to get rid of Jesus. And in a way, I think the warning here is that God is coming for us Christians to upset our whole way of being.
Yes.
You know, I've always liked the idiom, upset the apple cart.
Yeah.
And I recently posted on Facebook, I'm like, I realize that most of the new Simpleton missionaries have never heard the idiom upset the apple cart.
Right.
So then I go on Facebook and I go, what's a more modern way of saying this, right? And then everyone who responds is like responding to don't upset the apple cart. And I'm like of the mindset of, no, you want to upset the apple cart. That's the way I use this idiom, which I think is a little bit backwards, right?
Yeah.
But the best response was update your operating system.
I thought that was I saw your query on Facebook, and the only thing I could think of was letting stuff hit the fan, you know?
Like you study theology, you read scripture, and you pray to let stuff hit the fan.
Yeah.
You do that in order to update your operating system, and that's scary.
Yeah. And there's something is going to be required of you. There's going to be a change. There's, you know, your worldview might be, I don't know. There's like, I think another problem we had and continue to have is like, you try to be like, are you able to convey the good news? You know, what has Jesus done for you? And people couldn't say, you know, it was like the world had not been dramatically changed in their life somehow because they had, you know.
And I guess, you know, part of having an awesome God, part of having an awesome, all-powerful God that is like good beyond your imagination is that he's very dangerous. Like Jesus was very dangerous. You know, he was dangerous to the religion, you know. Yeah. And our own personal religion, when we go to God, we need to acknowledge the danger that we're getting ready to face.
This is very like Narnia. Aslan is not a tame lion, you know. He's a dangerous lion.
Yeah. So anyway, I guess, you know, sometimes when we go to talk about the good news, I think what you said is interesting, that we sometimes don't know how he changed our lives. I don't ever blame anyone if that's the case. Where I kind of get annoyed with them is if they start talking about how he changed their lives and they're saying something so vanilla or something that it feels like their temperament would have done anyway, that it's like just does not speak to anyone.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Or like if you tell your own story of love of God and Christianity and it's not authentic, if it doesn't resonate with other people, you really can't be a missionary.
Yeah. I had this seminarian one time, we were chit-chatting and he was kind of asking my story, and you know, I was saying this thing, you know, I was very moved by God, but then I like really felt the pull of the world. And I spent like years in my 20s, you know, feeling like I was torn apart, you know, by this. And he was like, oh, isn't that the way for all of us? And I was like, yeah. So then I asked him something and I'm like, so what's your deal? He was like, well, I went to high school seminary and now I'm a freshman in college. And I was like, oh, isn't that like, it was like he was saying this thing like, isn't that the way, but had like zero experience of this. And he like turned bright red because he knew he had sort of said a thing that was not like authentic to his life, you know?
we're dancing dangerously close to like condemning someone who hasn't like had something, who's been living a good life and haven't had something upturned.
I was very endeared by that seminarian. I also think like maybe I wouldn't have been able to speak very well about having my life upturned when I was in my younger 20s, you know. But yeah, and I don't want to condemn anyone. I also think it's kind of like a part of the Catholic culture or a lack in Catholic culture. We're not like talking about, you know, when did you convert? What did Jesus do for you? You know, and we need to think about those things and understand them, you know.
Well, so, and that you're right. That's a lack of Catholic culture. I think where I wanted to start this idea with is that sometimes when we do theology and stuff, what we're doing is we're kind of making ourselves feel good. Sometimes we have a wow, God is really good, you know?
Yeah.
Ultimately, there needs to be danger in it.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And otherwise, like, you're not going to convince someone who's set in their ways that's on a bad path to switch unless there's danger in it.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Right.
Somehow related to this is how there's certain people who seem more sexually promiscuous or less sexually promiscuous almost naturally.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know, not from grace, but more from just like their disposition or their psychological makeup, right? Yeah. And it's like we're almost more willing to welcome the person who's more naturally prudish into a church group than someone who's more like who's that? We talked about this guy recently, the crazy English comedian.
Oh my gosh, Russell Brand.
Yeah, Russell Brand has some real spiritual stuff going on. Like, he's also completely crazy, you know, but like he needs to be in church too.
Yeah.
You know, not just a prudish person, you know.
I don't think he's completely crazy, but I
was just kind of covering myself so I didn't, no one took me as endorsing Russell Brand's ideas.
Yeah.
Well, anyway, good. All right, good to see you. Good to talk to you.
You too.
All right, everybody, subscribe on YouTube, subscribe to our podcast, hit the like button, and if you think this would help anyone, please share it. Thank you.
All right. See you, Clark.